Fathers and Sons, Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is going to present the arrival home, but Turgenev lets us know that the event is very different from what it would have been in the past. In the past, all these servants would have come and sort of gather around to greet the arrival of the young master, but now the activity is frowned upon as being archaic. We are going to see Fenichka kind of peeking out of the window, and then she disappears. But really what we want to look at is the contrast between the two types of servants represented by Peter and Prokofiev. As noted earlier, Peter's kind of the new liberated type of servant, and the other belongs to the old school. So we meet Arkady's uncle for the first time. He's going to stand in contrast to everything that Bazarov, Arkady's friend, represents. Pavel is very conscious of his habits of dress and his actions. He's elegant, he's aristocratic, and so, of course, when he sees Bazarov, he is immediately repulsed. Pavel delights in throwing out these kind of French phrases, making every effort that he can to appear very Europeanized. You should be aware that during a certain period of Russian history, educated Russians did correspond mainly in French and used Russian only in communication with the serfs or other low-class servants. We notice for the first time that Arkady is very uneasy over his return home. He's outgrown his own childhood, and now that he's come back to the scene of his past, it's difficult for him to assume this new role. So he has two loyalties. One of them is to his home and to his background, and the other is to his new friend and to these new advanced ideas that he is starting to consider. Arkady tries to defend his uncle here because he respects him in many ways, and he dislikes the fact that his friend Bazarov refers to him as this archaic phenomenon. As much as Arkady tries to deny it objectively, though, we do see that he and his father are essentially alike. He acknowledges that his father's a timid man, but the reader also knows that Arkady himself is rather timid. So here we go. Here is Chapter 4 of Fathers and Sons.
Chapter 4. No crowd of house serfs ran out onto the steps to meet the gentleman. A little girl of 12 years old made her appearance alone. After her, there came out of the house a young lad very like Pyotr, dressed in a coat of gray livery with white armorial buttons, the servant of Pavel Petrovich Kirsanov. Without speaking, he opened the door of the carriage and unbuttoned the apron of the coach. Nikolai Petrovich, with his son and Bazarov, walked through a dark and almost empty hall, from behind the door of which they caught a glimpse of a young woman's face, into a drawing room furnished in the most modern style. "Here we are at home," said Nikolai Petrovich, taking off his cap and shaking back his hair. "That's the great thing. Now we must have supper and rest." "A meal would not come amiss, certainly," observed Bazarov, stretching, and he dropped onto a sofa. Yes, let us have supper. Supper directly." Nikolai Petrovich, with no apparent reason, stamped his foot. And here, just at the right moment, comes Prokofiev. A man of about 60 entered, white-haired, thin and swarthy, in a cinnamon-colored dress coat with brass buttons and a pink neckerchief. He smirked, went up to kiss Arkady's hand, and bowing to the guest, retreated to the door and put his hands behind him. "Here he is, Prokofiev," began Nikolai Petrovich. "He's come back to us at last. Well, how do you think him looking?" "As well as could be," said the old man, and was grinning again, but he quickly knitted his bushy brows. "You wish supper to be served," he said impressively. Yes, please. But won't you like to go to your room first, Yevgeny Vasilievich?" "No, thanks, I don't care about it. Only give orders for my little box to be taken there, and this garment too," he added, taking off his frieze overcoat. "Certainly. Prokofiev, take the gentleman's coat." Prokofiev, with an air of perplexity, picked up Bazarov's garment in both hands, and holding it high above his head, retreated on tiptoe. "And you, Arkady, are you going to your room for a minute?" "Yes, I must wash," answered Arkady, and was just moving towards the door, but at that instant there came into the drawing room a man of medium height, dressed in a dark English suit, a fashionable low cravat, and kid shoes. Pavel Petrovich Kirsanov. He looked about 45. His close-cropped gray hair shone with a dark luster, like new silver. His face, yellow but free from wrinkles, was exceptionally regular and pure in line, as though carved by a light and delicate chisel, and showed traces of remarkable beauty. Especially fine were his clear, black, almond-shaped eyes. The whole person of Arkady's uncle, with its aristocratic elegance, had preserved the gracefulness of youth and that air of striving upwards away from earth, which for the most part is lost after the 20s are past. Pavel Petrovitch took out of his trouser pocket his exquisite hand with its long, tapering pink nails, a hand which seemed still more exquisite from the snowy whiteness of the cuff, buttoned with a single big opal, and gave it to his nephew. After a preliminary handshake in the European style, he kissed him thrice after the Russian fashion. That is to say, he touched his cheek 3 times with his perfumed mustaches and said, "Welcome." Nikolai Petrovitch presented him to Bazarov. Pavel Petrovitch greeted him with a slight inclination of his supple figure and a slight smile. But he did not give him his hand, and even put it back into his pocket. "I had begun to think you were not coming today," he began in a musical voice, with a genial swing and shrug of the shoulders, as he showed his splendid white teeth. "Did anything happen on the road?" "Nothing happened," answered Arkady. "We were rather slow, but we're hungry as wolves now. Hurry up, Prokofitch, Dad, and I'll be back directly." "Stay, I'm coming with you," cried Bazarov, pulling himself up suddenly from the sofa. Both the young men went out. "Who is he?" asked Pavel Petrovitch. "A friend of Arkasha's. According to him, a very clever fellow." "Is he going to stay with us?" "Yes." "That unkempt creature?" "Why, yes." Pavel Petrovitch drummed with his fingertips on the table. "I fancy Arkady s'est dégourdi," he remarked. "I'm glad he has come back." At supper there was little conversation. Bazarov, especially, said nothing, but he ate a great deal. Nikolai Petrovitch related various incidents in what he called his career as a farmer, talked about the impending government measures, about committees, deputations, the necessity of introducing machinery, etc. Pavel Petrovitch paced slowly up and down the dining room. He never ate supper, sometimes sipping at a wineglass of red wine, and less often uttering some remark or rather exclamation of the nature of, "Ah, aha, hmm." Arkady told some news from Petersburg, but he was conscious of a little awkwardness. That awkwardness which usually overtakes a youth when he has just ceased to be a child, and has come back to a place where they are accustomed to regard him and treat him as a child. He made his sentences quite unnecessarily long, avoided the word daddy, and even sometimes replaced it by the word father, mumbled, it is true, between his teeth. With an exaggerated carelessness, he poured into his glass far more wine than he really wanted, and drank it all off. Prokofitch did not take his eyes off him, and kept chewing his lips. After supper, they all separated at once. "Your uncle's a queer fish," Bazarov said to Arkady, as he sat in his dressing gown by his bedside, smoking a short pipe. "Only fancy such style in the country. His nails, you ought to send them to an exhibition." "Why, of course you don't know," replied Arkady. "He was a great swell in his own day, you know. I will tell you his story one day. He was very handsome, you know, used to turn all the women's heads." "Now, so that's it, is it? So he keeps it up in memory of the past. It's a pity there's no one for him to fascinate here, though. I kept staring at his exquisite collars. They're like marble, and his chin's shaved simply to perfection. Come, Arkady Nikolaevich, isn't that ridiculous?" "Perhaps it is, but he's a splendid man, really." "An antique survival. But your father's a capital fellow. He wastes his time reading poetry and doesn't know much about farming, but he's a good-hearted fellow. My father's a man in 1,000. Did you notice how shy and nervous he is?" Arkady shook his head as though he himself were not shy and nervous. "It's something astonishing," pursued Bazarov. "These old idealists, they develop their nervous systems till they break down, so balance is lost. But good night. In my room." Is lost. But good night. In my room, there's an English washstand, but the door won't fasten. Anyway, that ought to be encouraged. An English washstand stands for progress. Bazarov went away, and a sense of great happiness came over Arkady. Sweet it is to fall asleep in one's own home, in the familiar bed, under the quilt, worked by loving hands, perhaps a dear nurse's hands, those kind, tender, untiring hands. Arkady remembered Yegorovna and sighed, and wished her peace in heaven. For himself, he made no prayer. Both he and Bazarov were soon asleep, but others in the house were awake long after. His son's return had agitated Nikolai Petrovitch. He lay down in bed, but did not put out the candles, and his head propped on his hand, he fell into long reveries. His brother was sitting long after midnight in his study, in a wide armchair before the fireplace, on which there smoldered some faintly glowing embers. Pavel Petrovitch was not undressed. Only some red Chinese slippers had replaced the kid shoes on his feet. He held in his hands the last number of the Galliani, but he was not reading. He gazed fixedly into the grate, where a bluish flame flickered, dying down, then flaring up again. God knows where his thoughts were rambling, but they were not rambling in the past only. The expression of his face was concentrated and surly, which is not the way when a man is absorbed solely in recollections. In a small back room, there sat on a large chest a young woman in a blue dressing jacket with a white kerchief thrown over her dark hair. Fenichka. She was half listening, half dozing, and often looked across towards the open door through which a child's cradle was visible, and the regular breathing of a sleeping baby could be heard. Chapter 5.